A bell tinkles. A customer asks for change. A girl 18, bright, laughing. The security camera above hums, recording an ordinary winter evening. Frosted windows, breath in the air. A coffee stand lit against the long Alaska dusk. Then the shot changes and the door opens. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. A man walks in, pockets practiced and ordinary. He smiles the smile of someone used to being invisible. He speaks calmly. He asks a question. 1 minute later, the girl is gone. It was footage taken on February 1st, 2012, at a small Anchorage coffee stand called Campground. The woman was Samantha Koenig. The man was later identified as Israel Keys, a meticulous, traveling killer who would unravel communities across the country and leave investigators facing a darker holiday season than anyone expected. Tonight we tell Samantha's story. We walk the shift that became her last cup. We trace the fast, careful threads that led investigators from a surveillance camera to a buried cache and ultimately to a suspect who had planned crimes with the cold precision of someone building a machine. We will be careful with what we describe and careful with how we remember, because this story is not about spectacle. It is about a life cut short, a family left with questions, and the slow, difficult work of law enforcement trying to stitch closure out of small facts. Samantha Sam Koenig was 18 years old in early 2012. Friends describe her as outgoing, clever, and eager to make her way in the world. She had a job, plans, and the kind of warm, ordinary energy that lights late-night coffee stands and small shops. She was finishing high school, saving money, and taking shifts where she could. On that cold February evening, she had been working what should have been a routine closing shift at Campground, a modest walk-up coffee stand serving students, shift workers, and passers-by in Midtown Anchorage. Israel Keys was outwardly unremarkable. In many ways, he was the kind of person who blends into background conversations, a man who could be pleasant, organized, and ordinary. But Keys was also methodical. He moved around the country in a pattern that allowed him to be both nomadic and invisible, using rental cars, burner phones, and prepositioned caches to commit crimes far from home and far from patterns that might draw attention. He described, later to investigators, a kind of professional approach to his crimes, planning, laying tools and money in hidden locations, and then traveling to commit abductions and murders in places where he had no social ties. Those caches, carefully buried, watertight, and complete with instruments and supplies, would become central evidence in the investigation that followed Samantha's disappearance. In late January and early February of 2012, Anchorage was in winter's hold, short days, long nights, and a city where small businesses like Campground were a hub of community for workers and students. Samantha's shift that evening was meant to be ordinary. The coffee stand had surveillance cameras on the ceilings. The footage recorded dozens of customers over the night, faces, small transactions, friendly greetings. No one would expect the footage to become the first public key to unlocking a serial killer's trail. Yet that tape, simple and unassuming, would be what changed everything. Meanwhile, investigators elsewhere were wrestling with a string of unsettling clues. In other parts of the country, bodies and disappearances seemed disconnected until a pattern of travel and buried caches began to suggest a single hand reaching across states and seasons. Keys would later tell authorities that he preferred to choose victims at random, sometimes at businesses that served late crowds, sometimes at rest stops or campgrounds. He relied on preparation, money stashed in different cities, weapons buried in remote caches, and an ability to vanish down highways after a crime. His method, clinical, premeditated, and coldly practical, made him a uniquely difficult subject to find. Rewinding the surveillance tape, the camera shows Samantha moving through her routine. Cash register clicks, customers exchanging jokes, the warmth of steam rising from cups. At about 9:30 p.m., a man walks in clean, polite, and unobtrusive. He asks for change. He speaks in a calm voice. On camera, there is nothing obviously violent about his entrance. He takes a step to the counter, And then the scene becomes a private transaction between two people that the camera, in its flat way, can only record as a line of pixels and a small exchange of sound to a viewer trained in narrative. The mundane is what makes the horror sharper. The ordinary gestures that human beings use to connect, to pass time, to survive the long cold. Keyes used those everyday moments as camouflage. He had, investigators later learned, planned, and he executed abductions with a speed and economy that left minimal immediate trace when viewed from outside the moment. There are two ways people vanish, suddenly and quietly. Samantha's disappearance was the latter. There were no public screams, no public struggle caught on camera. Instead, the videotape shows movement that, played back, looks ordinary until it is not. Moments after the man leaves, patrons pause, then realize Samantha is gone. The small circle of people who had shared the evening of work and conversation now had an empty counter between them and questions they could not yet form. When the alarm was raised and police arrived, they began to treat the coffee stand not as a crime scene frozen in blood, but as a place of missing pieces, a missing employee, receipts to be checked, customers to be interviewed. The immediate, visceral horror of a violent scene was replaced by the cold, procedural horror of tracking a person who had been taken without direct witnesses to a struggle, a disappearance wrapped in the quiet of a long winter night. This is important. While we describe the sequence of events that led to the alarm and the investigation, we will not linger on graphic or gratuitous detail. The truth of what happened is already painful enough for Samantha's family and friends. What matters for us is the method, the impact, and the work that followed. The human being who poured lives into plans and loved ones. That is what we center in this story, not the mechanics of harm. Detectives first returned to the surveillance footage and the witness statements. One customer's recollection, cross-checked with recorded timestamps, led to a small but crucial lead. A man had left with Samantha. The images were low resolution, but they showed details, posture, gait, clothing, and most importantly, the time and direction in which he exited. That exit led investigators to the street, and from the street, to a trail of small clues. Anchorage police coordinated with federal agents. The FBI, already attuned to the possibility of cross-jurisdictional crimes, stepped in. For them, the case immediately raised a question. Was this disappearance local, or was it part of a pattern? The answer came in the months that followed as investigators pulled rental records, surveillance from nearby businesses, and phone logs. The tapestry of small, ordinary records, a rental agreement here, a gas receipt there would begin to outline travel routes that were anything but random. Keyes' use of rental cars and temporary arrangements was a deliberate strategy to avoid leaving a long-term trail. But even the most careful plan leaves traces. Receipts, CCTV from gas stations, and the fingerprints of human choices. Investigators searched databases for vehicles in the area that matched the suspects. They subpoenaed rental records. They mapped travel logs against missing person reports across state lines. As the search widened, patterns formed. Keyes' travel history matched places where other suspicious disappearances and killings had occurred. Those correlations did not prove everything, but they strengthened the hypothesis that the man in the tape, the man who took Samantha, was part of a broader, relentless pattern of predation that had moved across the country for years. One of the most chilling discoveries in the investigation was not a confession, nor a dramatic testimonial, but a plastic orange bucket stashed under rocks at a remote reservoir, a watertight container filled with tools, weapons, and supplies. The bucket contained a .22 caliber Ruger, ammunition, various implements, and other items that suggested method and planning. These caches were not impulsive. They were premeditated, intended to make a perpetrator independent of local supply chains. If you bury what you need where you might later be, you can appear to be in two times at once, moving casually in the present while relying on preparations you made months earlier. That level of foresight turned a violent criminal into something closer to a criminal enterprise. After Keyes was arrested, an arrest that followed an accumulation of these small but compelling strands, investigators sat with him. In recorded interviews, he was calm, deliberate, sometimes evasive, sometimes candid in ways that felt almost clinical. He admitted to certain crimes, denied others, and hinted at many more. Those interviews became a rare, anguished testimony, a portrait of a man who described his crimes as tasks, who spoke of planning and execution as if laying out a map. The interviews revealed both his method and his chilling indifference to the human cost. As leads converged, law enforcement collected forensics, DNA samples, fingerprints, and the careful catalog of possessions. They also made a crucial, difficult decision: to release surveillance footage and other evidence to the public. The goal was twofold: to prompt more tips and to alert other jurisdictions to a suspect whose pattern might cross state lines. The release of the Common Ground's tape and images of caches and evidence led to an influx of information, calls from citizens who recognized patterns, and renewed investigations into cold cases that now fit a possible Keyes signature. That community response would help tie disparate tragedies to a single hand, piece by piece. Behind every procedural step were people: detectives working late, analysts cross-referencing databases, and families watching public releases with trembling hope and dread. The Koenig family, like many families in cases like this, found themselves thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. They were forced to participate in publicity campaigns and to relive details for new broadcasts, while privately grieving and seeking answers. Their resilience, the courage to speak publicly, the determination to keep the case alive became part of the investigation's momentum. The accumulation of evidence and public tips led to Israel Keyes' arrest in mid-March 2012. Authorities charged him in connection with Samantha Koenig's kidnapping and murder. A federal grand jury returned an indictment in April 2012. For a time, it looked like the painstaking work of investigators might produce the justice Samantha's family sought. Charges were filed, and prosecutors prepared for trial. In interviews with investigators, Keyes confessed to several crimes and alluded to others. He spoke of using pre-buried caches, of traveling widely to find victims, and of a deeply methodical approach to choosing and abducting victims. But his accounts were also partial. He hinted at victims he would not name. He drew macabre symbols in his jail cell and left writings that investigators later examined closely for clues. The result was a frustrating mixture of confession and obfuscation. Keyes provided enough to confirm that he had been far more active than initially known, but he withheld specifics that might have given families the closure they desperately wanted. On December 1, 2012, before he could face all charges in court and before families received the full legal reckonings they expected, Israel Keyes died by suicide in his cell. Officials said he used a concealed blade and bedding to take his life. The suicide was a devastating blow for investigators and victims' families. It denied the public trial that might have produced fuller admissions, legal closure, and a full accounting for the lives lost. It left many questions unanswered and increased the burden on law enforcement to piece together the scope of Keyes' crimes from the fragments he left behind. After Keyes' death, the FBI and other agencies released further materials: photographs of buried caches, transcripts of interviews, and disturbing items found in his cell, including drawings and writings. One of the most unsettling releases included drawings of skulls and other images that suggested the number of victims he may have had. The releases aimed to help the public and investigators identify other possible victims and to encourage tips that might match missing persons with Keyes' timeline of travel. Over the years, those releases spurred renewed cold case inquiries and gave families of missing persons leads they could follow. But the absence of Keyes from a courtroom, the absence of a formal public accounting, remained a painful gap. Legally, Keyes' death complicated the arc of prosecution. Some cases remained unresolved because the accused could no longer be tried. For families, the legal closure that convictions bring sentences, formal findings of guilt, and the ritual of a public trial was stolen. Emotionally, many families were left in an ambiguous state. A mixture of relief that the alleged killer would not roam free, frustration at the missing legal denouement, and grief that had not been neatly packaged by a conviction. The community grappled with the reality that a methodical predator had used public spaces, holiday travel patterns, and ordinary acts of trust as cover, and that sometimes justice comes in partial and unsatisfying fragments. We began at a coffee counter with a bell and a simple request for change. We end, as investigators did, with facts that are both clinical and unbearably human. A surveillance tape, a buried bucket, an indictment that never saw a final verdict, and a family left to carry a memory where a future should have been. Samantha Koenig's story is not just an entry in a true crime log. It is a life, a sister, daughter, and friend whose ordinary choices placed her where a calculated predator could find her. The horror of this case is not only in the act committed, but in the daily reality it reveals. That people who seem ordinary can hide extraordinary cruelty, and that the systems we rely on, law enforcement, public awareness, and community memory, must work together patiently and persistently to transform small clues into answers. If there is a lesson here beyond the shock, it is this: vigilance and compassion matter. The footage that solved this case did not do so alone. It needed the tireless work of officers, analysts, and the public who responded to calls for help. It needed the family members who refused to let their loved one become one more name lost to the passage of time. And it needed a willingness from all of us to keep opening old files, to re-examine evidence, and to speak when a memory tips the scale. We close with a question rather than an answer. How do we honor Samantha and others like her? Perhaps by turning our attention, in cold hours and long days, to the small observations we might otherwise dismiss. Perhaps by supporting the families who ask for answers, and by insisting that the ordinary places we gather, a coffee stand, a bus stop, a campground, remain spaces where people can be safe. Samantha poured cups. She served smiles. She held ordinary human hours, and for that, she deserves to be remembered not as a statistic in a file, but as a person who mattered. If you have information that could help link other missing person cases to this timeline, please contact the FBI or local law enforcement. Cases like this are solved one clue at a time, and sometimes it is one small recollection, one overlooked receipt, or one moment of courage that changes everything.